Hey everyone, are you ready for another deep dive? Today we're taking a close look at some resveratrol research. And wow, some really interesting stuff here. We've got a scientific study on PCOS and resveratrol, a paper on how resveratrol is absorbed or not absorbed, as we'll find out at Deep Dives in Nature Review's Drug Discovery, and get this, a study on how resveratrol teams up with something called spermidine to boost something called autophagy. This is going to be fun.
Sounds like we've got a lot to unpack.
We do. And I'll be honest, I've totally fallen for the resveratrol hype myself. It's in red wine, people say it's anti-aging, good for your heart. I mean, who wouldn't be tempted, right? And looking at your research on PCOS, it seems like you might be interested in those potential benefits too.
You're right, resveratrol has definitely generated a lot of buzz. But like with many things in science, the reality is a bit more complicated than the headlines might suggest.
Okay, so let's unpack that complication. What's the missing piece when it comes to resveratrol?
Well, the first thing to understand is that resveratrol has, well, it has a bit of an absorption problem. You included a paper about the absorption and half-life of resveratrol, and that brings an important point to light. Less than 1% of what you take orally actually makes it into your bloodstream.
Wait, are you serious? Less than 1%. What happens to the rest of it?
Most of it, we're talking a huge amount, gets metabolized, broken down in the gut and the liver. Your body turns it into other compounds, primarily glucuronides and sulfates. Imagine ordering a gourmet meal and only getting a tiny bite, while the rest mysteriously transforms into something else.
So our bodies are basically saying, we'll take this tiny bit, but the rest, we're changing the recipe.
Pretty much. And because of that rapid metabolism, the active resveratrol, one everyone makes such a big deal about, is only in your bloodstream for a really short time. We're talking a half-life of around 2 hours.
2 hours. That's wild. So if so little resveratrol is actually reaching our cells, does that mean all the hype is, to put it bluntly, unfounded? Should we just give up on the red wine dream?
Not quite. And this is where things get interesting. Those metabolites, the glucuronides and sulfates, they're not just sitting on the sidelines. They have their own biological activity.
Hold on, are you saying that even though the resveratrol itself might be fleeting,
Right.
it's transforming into something else that still might have benefits?
You got it. And that's where this really fascinating idea of xenohermesis comes into play. That in-depth article from Nature Review's Drug Discovery you shared, well, it digs into this concept. In simple terms, xenohermesis suggests that our bodies have adapted over time to respond to chemical signals in our environment, including the ones coming from plants.
Okay, that makes sense. After all, plants are full of different compounds.
Right. And when a plant is under stress, and think about those grapes being used to make wine, they produce compounds like resveratrol as a defense mechanism, a way to protect themselves.
So it's like the grapes are sending out an SOS.
Exactly. And the fascinating thing is that our bodies may have learned to interpret those signals. When we consume something like resveratrol, it's like our body is listening in on the plant world, hearing that stress signal and thinking, whoa, things must be tough out there. Better activate my defenses.
So it's like how a little stress can be beneficial for us in the long run.
You got it. That's a great way to think about it. It's still an emerging theory, but the research suggests that resveratrol might be tricking our bodies into a beneficial stress response, activating similar pathways as calorie restriction, which has been linked to longevity.
Now that you mention it, I've heard about calorie restriction and longevity. But honestly, who wants to live on a super restrictive diet if a glass of red wine could have similar benefits, right?
Well, I wouldn't go that far just yet, but the resveratrol research is definitely intriguing. For example, you included an article from Nature Review's Drug Discovery, and it actually cites studies about how resveratrol affects cardiovascular health.
Now that's something I was wondering about. Red wine always has that heart-healthy reputation. But is there any real science behind it?
There's definitely growing evidence, though it's not a guaranteed solution. Some studies show that resveratrol can improve the function of blood vessels. Actually, the Nature Reviews article highlights studies 77 through 80, as well as 91, which found that resveratrol might play a part in reducing platelet aggregation, which is basically preventing blood cells from clumping together, which can then lower the risk of heart attacks.
Okay, so maybe it's not a free pass to eat whatever we want, but it sounds like resveratrol could give our cardiovascular system a little extra help. And what about all those claims about resveratrol and cancer? I feel like I've seen headlines about that too.
It's true. There's been some early research indicating that resveratrol might be able to inhibit or even slow down tumor growth in certain types of cancer. But And this is important. Most of those studies have been done in vitro, meaning in a lab setting, not in actual people.
So not a reason to ditch conventional cancer treatments just yet.
Absolutely not. And it's important to be super clear here. Resveratrol is not a replacement for proven cancer therapies. But those early findings are pretty promising. If you're interested in those specific studies, the Nature Reviews article you provided references studies 15, 27, and 51 through 56.
Definitely saving that for later. One more resveratrol miracle claim I'm curious about. What about brain health? There always seem to be articles popping up about how it can boost memory, protect against cognitive decline. Is there any truth to that?
There's some early evidence, and again, I want to emphasize that word early, that points to resveratrol having neuroprotective properties, which could potentially benefit conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Studies 136 through 138 in that Nature Reviews article touch upon this a little bit, but just like with the other potential benefits we've talked about, there needs to be more research.
It seems like with resveratrol, there are a lot of maybes and potential benefits. Not exactly a magic bullet, but definitely sparking some really interesting areas of research. And speaking of intriguing research, let's talk about that study you shared on spermidine. That one really caught my eye.
Yes. The spermidine study. It's definitely a fascinating one, especially considering what we've been discussing about how things can work together in the body.
Okay, before we dive into that, could we do a super quick recap of what spermidine even is? Is it something else in red wine?
Not this time. Spermidine is actually found in foods like soybeans and citrus fruits. This study you highlighted, spermidine and resveratrol, JCB_2108167.PDF, as you mentioned, looks at how both resveratrol and spermidine can influence something called autophagy.
Autophagy. Now, that's one of those sciencey words I was a little intimidated by. I have a feeling it's a little more complex than just like some regular spring cleaning happening inside our cells.
Let's just say it's a very specialized type of cleaning. Think of it this way. Autophagy is like your cells having a highly efficient recycling program for old furniture, broken appliances, and even unwanted guests.
Okay, now I'm picturing little sanitation workers inside my cells hauling away all the trash. Much more fun to visualize than just autophagy.
It's definitely a more vivid image. But on a serious note, during autophagy, cells break down and then recycle damaged components. That includes misfolded proteins, which are basically proteins that aren't shaped correctly and can cause issues, and even those invaders we talked about earlier, like bacteria or viruses.
So it's like a microscopic self-defense system.
Exactly. And this recycling that happens during autophagy, it's crucial for keeping your cells healthy and functioning properly, especially as we get older.
That makes a lot of sense. Like, as we age, things start to break down. Our cells aren't exactly immune to that, right?
Yeah.
So where does resveratrol come into play here? What's the link between resveratrol and this cellular recycling process?
Well, resveratrol is able to activate a specific protein called ARTO-T1, sometimes called SIRT2-1. And guess what SART-T1 is linked to? You guessed it. Longevity and autophagy.
So it's like resveratrol is the key to unlocking that autophagy pathway.
That's a great way to put it. But like many things, it's not the only key. And this is where that study about spermidine comes in. Remember how we talked about how resveratrol itself doesn't stick around in the body for long? Well, it turns out that even though resveratrol and spermidine are from totally different sources, they both seem to boost autophagy. However, they do it in different ways.
Wait, are you saying that even though resveratrol might be transforming into those metabolites we were discussing, and spermidine is a totally different compound altogether, they both end up boosting this cellular recycling process? That's amazing. Different paths, same destination.
Precisely. And here's the most fascinating part. The study indicates that low doses of both compounds combined were even more effective at inducing autophagy than either one alone.
Hold on, so are you saying that a little red wine and, say, a snack of edamame, could boost my autophagy even more than if I just had one or the other? That's wild. Two compounds are better than one.
Exactly. It really showcases the power of synergy, how different elements can work together in ways we don't expect to create an even bigger effect.
It's like those superhero teams where each hero has unique abilities, but when they team up, they're unstoppable.
And I love that analogy. And the synergy between resveratrol and spermidine speaks to something really important, the potential of combining certain foods for an even bigger benefit. That in itself is a fascinating area of research.
Okay, you've convinced me adding soybeans to my grocery list. But before I get too carried away, I'm sure there's a little cautionary note here.
It's always good to be cautious. Remember that this is just one study. We need more research, particularly research done on humans.
Good reminder. A lot of the research about resveratrol and autophagy is still in its early phases.
Very true. But that's what makes it so exciting. There's just so much we're still discovering about how these compounds work in our bodies and the potential they hold. But before we move on, I don't want to forget about your interest in resveratrol and PCOS. We've talked about the general benefits, but I'm ready to dig into that specific study you found whenever you are.
Perfect timing. That's exactly where I was hoping we'd head next. Okay, so we're about to delve into how resveratrol might affect PCOS. But before we do, could you give us a quick explanation of what PCOS is, just in case some of our listeners aren't familiar?
Of course. PCOS stands for polycystic ovary syndrome. It's a hormonal disorder that affects a lot of women, about 1 in 10 women of childbearing age, in fact.
Wow, that's a significant number of women who could be dealing with this.
It is, and it can show up in many different ways. PCOS can cause irregular periods, acne, and it can make it harder to get pregnant. And even beyond those more well-known symptoms, it's also been linked to a higher risk of certain health problems down the line, things like type 2 diabetes and heart disease.
So it's not just about having cysts on the ovaries then. It sounds like it's this whole hormonal cascade that can have pretty far-reaching effects.
You hit the nail on the head. PCOS is all about hormonal imbalances, especially when it comes to androgens. They're often called male hormones, although everyone has them to some degree. But in women with PCOS, those androgen levels are higher than usual. And those imbalances, they can lead to those cysts developing on the ovaries, but they also impact other systems in the body.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just one isolated thing happening. It's about how those hormones are impacting all these different processes. So bringing it back to that study you mentioned, what exactly did researchers find about how resveratrol could play a role in all of this?
This particular study was looking at the effects of resveratrol supplements on women who'd been diagnosed with PCOS. And the results were interesting, especially considering what we've already discussed about resveratrol in general.
All right, you've got my attention. Tell me more.
Well, one of the key findings was that taking resveratrol supplements actually led to a pretty significant decrease in testosterone levels in these women.
That's huge. Didn't you say that having higher testosterone is one of the hallmarks of PCOS? It's like resveratrol is going straight to the source, tackling one of the root causes.
You got it. And it gets even more interesting. Resveratrol didn't just lower testosterone, it also seemed to improve insulin sensitivity in these women.
Okay, remind me again why insulin sensitivity is so important in the context of PCOS.
Okay.
It's all coming back to those interconnected systems, right?
Exactly. Insulin resistance, which is basically the opposite of being insulin sensitive, is a really common problem for women with PCOS. It basically means their bodies aren't responding to insulin as well as they should. And that can lead to high blood sugar, which, down the line, increases the risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
Right, that makes sense. So if resveratrol is helping improve insulin sensitivity, it's almost like it's addressing two major things in PCOS at the same time. Those high testosterone levels, A and D, this insulin resistance, they can have such serious consequences later on.
That's exactly right. And there's even more. The study also connected resveratrol to a decrease in inflammatory markers in these women.
Inflammation, never a good sign. Is there a link between inflammation and PCOS specifically?
There is. It's pretty common to see chronic low-grade inflammation in women with PCOS, and it's thought to be a factor in some of those long-term health risks we were talking about.
Wow, so we're talking about potentially lower testosterone, better insulin sensitivity, AD reduced inflammation.
Yeah.
It's like resveratrol is fighting PCOS on multiple fronts.
It definitely seems that way, based on the study at least, and I know you've heard me say this before, it's important to remember that this is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. We need more research to back up these findings and to figure out things like the best dosage and any potential long-term effects of using resveratrol supplements, particularly in women with PCOS.
Of course. We definitely don't want to get ahead of ourselves and draw any big conclusions based on a single study. But these early results are definitely really promising. It sounds like resveratrol could be a valuable tool for managing PCOS and potentially even mitigating some of those long-term health risks we talked about.
I agree. It's definitely an area ripe for future research, and I think this study really highlights what we were discussing before. Even though resveratrol itself might not hang out in the body for very long, it's clearly setting off a chain reaction of effects that have some potentially major benefits.
It all circles back to those metabolites, the behind-the-scenes players. Speaking of behind the scenes, Let's get back to autophagy for a bit. We talked about how resveratrol can activate that SIRT1 protein, which is involved in autophagy.
Mhm.
But if I'm being honest, I'm still not totally clear on how this whole cellular recycling process actually works. I get the concept, it's super cool,
Yeah.
but I need a little more detail than just those garbage trucks to wrap my head around it.
You're right, it is a complex process. But let's stick with that garbage truck analogy for a minute, just as a starting point. So picture those little garbage trucks called autophagosomes.
Garbage trucks it is. Much easier to visualize.
So these autophagosomes are cruising around your cells, right? And as they're cruising, they're picking up all the cellular junk we were talking about before, those damaged proteins, worn out cell parts, even those unwanted invaders like bacteria and viruses.
Okay, so the autophagosomes are like the sanitation workers, going around and gathering up all the stuff that doesn't belong.
Exactly. But they don't just gather up the waste and then dump it anywhere. They very carefully transport it to a special cellular recycling center called the lysosome.
So the lysosome is like the processing plant or the sorting facility where they figure out what to do with all that garbage.
That's a great way to think about it. The lysosome is where that cellular waste gets broken down. Think of it like a cellular incinerator. But instead of just burning things up, it uses powerful enzymes to break that waste down into its most basic building blocks.
Okay, so the garbage trucks dump their loads into the incinerator, but instead of just going up in smoke, the incinerator transforms that trash into something usable again. That's amazing. It's like the most efficient recycling system ever.
It really is an incredible system. The lysosome breaks that waste down into amino acids, fatty acids, and other essential parts that the cell can then use to build new proteins, organelles, basically anything it needs.
It's incredible how our bodies have their own little waste management systems, all happening on such a tiny scale.
It really speaks to how intricate and efficient our cells are. And this whole process, this autophagy, it's absolutely essential for keeping our cells healthy and functioning the way they should. Without it, our cells would basically just become overrun with cellular debris, which can cause all sorts of problems, dysfunction, and disease.
So it's more than just about our cells being clean. It's about ensuring those cells have what they need, the building blocks to keep functioning at their best.
Precisely. Autophagy is a key player in cellular health, and it's involved in so many different processes, from immunity and inflammation to how we age and even the development of certain diseases.
I'm starting to understand why there's so much buzz around autophagy these days. And I'm guessing that resveratrol, with its potential to stimulate autophagy by activating RT1, is a big part of all this research.
It absolutely is. Resveratrol is one of a number of compounds that's being researched for its potential to boost autophagy and support cellular health.
This is all so fascinating. But before we get completely lost in the world of resveratrol and autophagy, let's not forget about our other autophagy superstar, spermidine. That study you mentioned, the one with resveratrol and spermidine teaming up, I'm ready to hear more about that.
Ah, yes, spermidine. That study really drives home the synergistic potential of these two compounds.
Synergy, our superhero team, is back in action. What I'm curious about is, how do they actually do it? How do resveratrol and spermidine tell those cellular garbage trucks to step up their game?
It's a bit more involved than just giving them a little nudge. Both resveratrol and spermidine are interacting with a really complex web of signaling pathways in our cells, and that's what ultimately leads to the increase in autophagy.
Signaling pathways, so like the communication networks of the cell, sending messages back and forth.
You got it. Our cells are in constant communication, sending and receiving signals that are basically controlling a whole range of cellular processes, including autophagy.
So when we consume resveratrol and spermidine, it's like they're tapping into those communication channels and telling the cell, hey, time to ramp up the recycling program.
Exactly. And here's the really fascinating part. They're doing this in completely different ways. We talked about how resveratrol can activate that SIRT1 protein, right? Well, SIRT1 is a type of enzyme called a deacetylase.
Deacetylase. Okay, there's that acetyl word popping up again.
You're catching on. Remember how we talked about that cellular control panel, the one with all the switches that turn proteins on or off? That's the acetyl proteome. And those switches, they're controlled by adding or removing something called an acetyl group. And a deacetylase, that's what SATO1 is. It removes those acetyl groups, which can actually change how a protein functions.
So it sounds like resveratrol, through SIRT1, is basically flipping some switches on the control panel to kickstart that autophagy process.
Exactly. Now, spermidine, on the other hand, it takes a different approach. Spermidine is thought to inhibit something called acetylases.
And those do the opposite of deacetylases. Instead of removing the acetyl groups, they add them.
Exactly. Acetylases are the ones attaching those off switches to certain proteins. So by inhibiting them, spermidine essentially keeps those autophagy-related proteins from being switched off.
Okay, so both resveratrol and spermidine are basically manipulating this control panel, this acetyl proteome, but in totally different ways. It's like they're both trying to turn up the volume on autophagy, but one's adjusting the bass while the other's fiddling with the treble.
I love that analogy. It really illustrates how our cells can use totally different approaches to fine-tune complex processes like autophagy. And the fact that these two compounds from completely different food sources can work together to enhance autophagy, each in their own way, it's incredible.
It really makes you appreciate how interconnected everything is in nature, you know?
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder what other synergistic combinations are out there just waiting to be discovered. This is pretty mind-blowing stuff.
I agree, it is mind-blowing. We've only just scratched the surface when it comes to understanding all the complexities of how our cells work and how these natural compounds can influence our health.
I feel like I've learned so much already. We've really dug deep into resveratrol, from how little of it actually sticks around to its potential benefits for PCOS and the role it plays in this process of autophagy. And then there's this whole incredible synergy with spermidine, these two compounds working together to boost our cellular recycling. My mind is officially blown.
It has been quite a deep dive. I hope it's given you a new perspective on the research you've been exploring.
I have a feeling I'll be looking at those studies in a whole new light, especially that one on resveratrol and spermidine. Which actually brings me to a question. Given what we've talked about with low doses being potentially more effective when they're combined, could a diet that's rich in both resveratrol-containing foods, like those grapes we talked about, and these spermidine-rich foods, like soybeans, could that be the key to unlocking even more health benefits?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that researchers are actively investigating. We're really just beginning to uncover the potential of these synergistic relationships in the food we eat.
It's like we've stumbled onto this whole new way of thinking about food, not just as calories or vitamins, but as this intricate system of compounds that are interacting with our bodies in these incredibly complex ways.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it really highlights how important it is to understand those interactions, not just for researchers, but for everyone. After all, we all make choices about what we eat every single day.
That's so true. Most of us aren't spending our days in a lab, but we can still learn from these scientific discoveries and make informed choices. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, you mentioned earlier that it's important to keep the bigger picture in mind when we're talking about scientific studies, especially when there are exciting new findings like this.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of a single study, especially when the findings are as intriguing as the ones from this resveratrol and spermidine research. But we have to remember that science is a process, always evolving. What we think we know today might be completely different tomorrow as more research comes out.
That's a really good reminder. It's not about taking one study as the be-all and end-all. It's about seeing it as one piece of a much larger puzzle. And we're all still putting that puzzle together, aren't we?
Absolutely. And that study we've been discussing, the one with resveratrol and spermidine, it's a great example of that. While those results about how they work together to boost autophagy, they're really promising, we need to see those results replicated in other studies. Ideally, larger studies with more diverse groups of people, just to be sure that those findings hold true across different populations.
So maybe hold off on buying those resveratrol and spermidine supplements in bulk for now.
It's probably a bit early for that. We're still in the early stages of really understanding how these compounds work together in humans. But this study, it opens some really interesting doors for future research. It challenges us to look beyond just individual nutrients and start thinking about those synergistic connections between different foods.
It's like you said, food is information. And the more we learn about the messages we're sending our bodies with each meal, the better choices we can make to support our health.
I couldn't agree more. And those choices, they don't have to be complicated. It's not about chasing after every new superfood or stressing over every little thing you eat. It's about understanding that bigger picture, appreciating how powerfully those foods can work together, and just choosing a variety of whole, nutrient-rich foods.
Now that's a message I can definitely get behind. So as we wrap up this incredible deep dive all about resveratrol, autophagy, and your fascinating research, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
For me, it's the power of curiosity and the importance of being open to new discoveries. Science is always changing, always evolving, and as we learn more about the complexities of the human body, we're only going to uncover even more amazing insights into how our diet impacts our health.
You said it. Keep those questions coming, everyone. Keep digging deeper. Keep exploring that research. Who knows what incredible things you'll discover. Thanks for joining us for this fascinating exploration. It's been a journey into the amazing world of resveratrol, autophagy, and all those incredible processes happening within our own cells. Until next time.